Okay, thank you for holding, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining today. My name is Rob Rittberg. I'll be the MC for today's webinar. We'll be covering all the exciting new features and functions available with the latest release of Stack 13. Presenting today will be Malcolm Jackson, one of our product owners, as well as Paul Bowen, who is our Director of Product. We're going to be leading you through all the new items, probably take around 45 minutes to get through each of those. Along the way, please feel free to submit any questions. We're going to take the last 15 minutes of the webinar to answer those questions or more if needed. We are recording this and we'll be sharing this after the webinar's done. So without further ado, I think we're starting with Malcolm Jackson. So I will let you get started. Malcolm.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, I'll go ahead and get started. I will share my screen. So the first thing we're going to be discussing today is some of the enhancements we've made to OpenClinica's import functionality. So we're looking now at our demo study and our demo environment. And I'll be showing off some of the changes we've made both to our tabular import and our XML import, some new capabilities there. So to get started up in the upper right, under my tasks menu, I'll go to the import data page. And just as a brief review, there are two ways you can import data into your OpenClinica. One of them is in an XML format, following the CDISC ODM XML extract format. Import XML files, and then you can also import tabular data, which would entail the creation of maybe a CSV file or some other kind of data arranged in a table as opposed to the hierarchical data structure of an XML file, and then use that along with a mapping file, mapping different columns in your table to items in your forms to import those clinical data. So first, let's take a look at our changes to the tabular import. So if I click this, I will go to the tabular import landing page. And here I'll be able to upload my mapping file and my data file. So before we actually do that, let's take a quick look at our mapping file to show what some of the changes are. So here in my editor, so here's my first mapping file that we'll be using. So this includes, and this is basically a properties configuration file that you'll pair with a data file. And the real meat of this is down here, where I am pairing columns in my file, like Q1, Q2, etc., to items in the form. You may recognize this as an item group and an item OID. So here I'm saying that the column with the header Q1 corresponds to the item with this ID. And I will open up my accompanying data file here. This is a very simple file, obviously, but here you can see I've labeled the columns Q1, Q2, etc., and then mapped the values within those to the items. So some of our new features, that's all just the basic tabular import functionality. Previously, what I'm going to be showing now is primarily our new ability to update existing data records through tabular import. Previously, you could use a file like this and add data to essentially empty items and import new records. One of the main things we've added, if I go look at this second mapping file, is if we see here, I have these properties, match criteria, and then a match action. So previously, the mapping file had one property here that was called skip match. And what that did was it allowed you to provide a list of items like this. And when you were doing the import, if the import detected that a record in your import file had a match to an existing record with those items, those values in those items, it would skip it and it would not import it. So that would allow you to avoid adding new instances, for example, of a repeating event where certain values already existed in the system and to identify a pre-existing record. So now the file, the mapping file has a more general match criteria property that allows you to specify that list of items. But in addition to skipping, we have update. So I could leave this as skip and do the same thing previously and sort of avoid importing duplicate records, or I can add an action of update. And that would allow me to, rather than skipping records in my data file where a match is detected in the system, to update that record with any data in my data file that I'm importing that are different from the existing data. So previously you couldn't do that. Going over to our other general mapping, some of these I've commented out just because they're not going to be used in the specific import I'm going to show you in just a moment. But other things we've added are the ability to specify the event start date and the event repeat key in your tabular file. Previously, you could only schedule new visit events as part of an XML import. Tabular imports only allowed you to import data to pre-scheduled visit events or non-visit events. Now you can provide a start date and schedule those. You can also use the repeat key as matching criteria to allow you to more easily identify unique records that you may want to update or skip as part of this import. Since we're updating data now, we can also add reasons for change automatically to anything we're updating in a completed form. And then we are also now able to set a form status as part of a tabular import. That previously wasn't possible. So now I can tell it to specifically remain in the initial data entry status after the import is complete, or I could set this to complete and cause the import to complete the form itself after the import is done. A final addition here is this property, which allows us to ignore unmapped columns. So what that means is that when I'm mapping columns in my file, like Q1, to items in my form, like this one, if I have columns in my data file, maybe the data file is an output of some other system or instrument, or maybe there's just extra columns in it for whatever reason that you don't want to import in this particular one. With this new feature, you can simply leave those columns out of the list and then set this to yes. And at that point, when you go to import it, it will just simply not import columns you have not explicitly listed in the mapping. If you leave this set to no, then it will still, then it will validate and ensure that all of your columns are mapped. And so that allows you to choose whether you want it to check, or if you know for sure there are columns you want to leave out, you can set this to yes and leave them unmapped. So let's go ahead and import this, and then we can also see some of the enhancements we've made to the tabular import logs, which previously looked a little different from our general XML log. So I'll go to my tabular import folder here. This is an import into a repeating event. So I'll pick this file and I'll just control click to multi-select the mapping file along with the data file and go to import these. So I'll click submit, and then it will tell me that it's going to process my file. It's processing the file. So now, previously the log for the tabular import would appear here. We've merged it. So now all the logs are located in the same place. They're located in the bulk actions log. You can see I was doing some other imports earlier, and here's the import I just submitted. You can see it's a tabular import job as opposed to an XML import job or some of the other kinds of jobs you can launch in bulk. And it's already done. It has a status of completed. So I'll go to view this on the log page for this particular import. And up here at the top, we have my summary. So there were a total of 4 rows in my data file. All of them were imported as new records. None were updated. Now, that particular file wasn't using an update action, so that's not particularly surprising. And the total number of rows is 4. So this is telling me here up at the top in the summary, all my rows succeeded. And then I do have an unmapped column that it omitted. So the column labeled Q8 was not considered in this. Down here, we see a list of every row in my file. So if I had many more rows, there'd be many more rows in this table, and it tells me what happened in each particular row. So if there was an error in this row, it would have failed, and then that row itself would not have been imported, and the rest of my file would have been. It will fail on a row-by-row basis, and you can see the outcome and the feedback row by row in this list. And then we do have a few more helpful logs we're displaying here. These can also be collapsed. So if I want to see this log, which is in fact just a copy and pasted reproduction of the mapping file I used, in case I want to come back much later in time and view this, I don't need to have preserved the file. It's right here. I can collapse that. And then down here at the bottom, we have a detailed import log that shows every single item in every record for every participant here and says exactly what happened here. Since these were all new records, they're all inserted successfully. I have my timestamp and so on. It's saying exactly which items they were. I can collapse that. I can collapse all and go straight down to the bottom if that's what I'm most interested in, or I can expand them all. And with an import like this, maybe the summary is enough. This was all a success, exactly what I wanted happened. So that's all well and good. So now let's back up a little bit. In fact, I'm going to back up all the way to the import page, and let's do a new import also of my tabular data. And now I'm going to import my update file. So this is that other mapping file I just showed you. I'll check my repeating update data file and my repeating update sample mapping file. And this will be very similar data, but some of the records will change. And I've used the update action in the mapping file. So when I search through this as part of the import and it's processing it, it's going to update existing records that match the criteria I've provided, rather than skipping them, or rather than adding a new instance of the repeating event for that participant. So here's another successful job, and I'll look at the updated log, and we can see here one row in fact failed. One was received as a new record. So there was no match. It did not hit on the match criteria, and there was one that did hit on the match criteria. So here we can see it failed because I failed to provide criteria necessary to identify an absolutely unique match for the record. So maybe there's multiple matches in the data. Rather than updating all of your existing records, it will not make that assumption. It will just fail, and it will not update any of them. I can see one of the rows updated an existing record, and one of them did not detect a match. So since I used the match action, no match was detected, so it did go ahead and add it as a new one. And then down here we see our log once again. So these are the enhancements we've made to the tabular import. We think this log page is a lot more helpful than what it previously was doing, which is simply making the logs like these available as a downloaded file. You can still from this page download a zipped pack of all of the logs if you want to process them as files, but they are also now visible in the interface in the same place as the XML import logs. So speaking of XML imports, now let's take a look quickly at the enhancements we've made to the XML import. So I'll go back to the import landing page, and this time instead of importing a tabular file, I'm going to import an XML file. So the changes we've made to the XML import, and I'm going to open my XML file now to take a quick look at those. This is an XML file. You might recognize the structure. It's specifying which study we're going to be importing into, the ID of the participant, as well as the event, the form within that event, and then the item group and item data within that form. So this is a file that shows a single event, a single form, and then a single item. And what we've added to the XML import is the ability to import, rather than clinical data, rather than importing new or updated values to items in your data, you can now import queries, as well as queries and annotations, which are those uneditable additions to the item, as opposed to an ongoing query thread that can be resolved. You can also use an XML import now to add signatures. So you can set the status of signed to an event as part of the import action, as well as add historical signature attestation. So I've commented out this line, since I'm not going to be signing this record as part of the import. But if you have an older system or some other set of data that already has signatures, you can sort of preserve the text of those historical attestations when something was signed in a different system as you're importing those into OpenClinica. And then these forms don't have a status set, but so I've commented this out as well. But you can also set an SDV status if if a previous system had an SDV status set for records you're now migrating into OpenClinica. You can preserve the SDV status. You can also use this to just update queries or SDV statuses in bulk, since it will check and it will go to update existing queries. You can see here's my query thread. It's within the item node because it's specifically attaching to an item. And here is my discrepancy note thread, which includes both the annotation and the query. So the query has this sequence of notes. Here's my new query, a second comment that sets it to updated and adds another text comment, and then the third one, which will close it. So when I import this, and this will be set to import this query onto the data I just imported as part of the tabular import. it will update the system to have this query, this full query thread as it appears in the sort of the snapshot of this XML file, and it will then be in the system attached to this item. So let's go ahead and do that. And as I said, we're not going to be setting the SDV status or importing a signature here, but those are also things you can do as part of the same note of sort of migrating this other data in. So I'll go ahead and pick a file. I will pick from my XML query import. So this has no mapping file associated. The XML by itself will be sufficient, unlike the tabular import. So I'll just submit this one. And it is now processing my import job. So I will go over to the bulk actions log once again and view the result of this import. So there were no item data in that file. It's not going to actually try to update any data or add any new data as part of this. It's only an import of those annotations and queries of the discrepancy note. So when I come in here, it looks like my node IDs were duplicate. So I've already imported this file once, and I need to specify a unique ID to this. So it actually hasn't added these queries, and you can see it's logging that there is one item in the file, and it is skipping it because there is no item value present in the data. So when it goes to attach these queries and annotations, since I failed to provide a unique ID for these, it is not going to import them. So just to show it succeed, because it's going to be fairly easy to do this, I'll just go through and quickly update these IDs. Now these IDs are, I'm specifying them manually here, but if you leave these out, the system actually will just automatically generate unique IDs, so you don't need to worry about doing what I'm doing now if you were planning on submitting this generally. If you don't have a specific need to set or preserve this unique query ID on the notes, you can simply leave it blank and it will automatically generate it. So let's repeat this once quickly, and then we can switch over to Paul. But just to show this, add the query once, I'll go ahead and open it and submit, and then go to the bulk actions log. We see another successful import job, and this time, hopefully in the results, we will see it is adding them. So it's inserting these queries, it's inserting this annotation, and here's the ID it's assigning them as it imports them. And once again, there was no item data, so it skipped that. So I can import queries and annotations in this way. If I went to this form and viewed it, in fact, if I go to the queries table, we will see, and since that query included a closed comment at the end, closing the thread off, here's that other one I imported previously, and now here's the one I just imported on this subject, and it's closed. So the query is now in the system just as if it was added through the interface. Okay, so that is what I have to show regarding the improvements to the tabular and the XML import. So on that note, let's go ahead and throw it over to Paul to demonstrate some of the other enhancements we've made. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And Paul, if you want to share yours.
Thank you all for joining. So I'll be showing a few different parts of the system here. So first thing I'm going to do is show a new read-only role we have. We have a study viewer and a site viewer. And look at the configuration of this first. Here I'm logged in as a data manager, and I'm looking at the study settings area. So in the user roles, I can see two new roles that were not present before Stack 13, site viewer and study viewer. So these are now available automatically for all studies, all existing studies, all new studies. They are present. See, based on the description here, these are roles that hopefully do exactly what they sound like. They have permission to view records. They don't have permission to modify data, add or update queries, or extract data. So these are really designed for users who need to, view forms in the system, view a list of the participants on the participant matrix, but they're not going to be able to interact, with and change the data or queries or set SDV status or anything like that. So when you're assigning users with a role, these are just in your standard list now. And like our other roles, these names can be customized. If you wanted a different name, you can You can change the name. You can also, if your study uses permission tags to set form by form access, these roles can be assigned tags or not to further limit, which data they can actually see. So here I am logged in as a study viewer. So just load this fresh. So participant matrix, we see, as normal here. If I come in and I view a participant details page, we can see I don't have the ability to schedule new visit events. I have the ability only to view a form. For existing common events, I can see these forms and I can view them. I don't have the ability to add new ones. So this is hopefully exactly what you would think by this rule. I'll just open a form here. So I can look at this, I get read-only mode. So I'm unable to change the data. I can view the history. I have no ability to add or interact with existing queries. I can see that, this medication name is clearly wrong, but I don't have the ability to, put something meaningful in there. And one thing I'll note is that while I have this open in read-only mode, other users are free to open this form and make edits or modify queries. So me being in that form as a read-only study viewer does not impact others' abilities to manage the data and queries on those forms. The tasks list is a bit smaller than for other user roles. For this user, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have the ability to extract data. So I can view some different logs. I can view the queries page, and I can view queries from here. So in fact, I can view what Malcolm had just added, and I can see that detail here. But that is the extent of what I can do. So once that is the first thing for me to show. Next, now I'm back in here as a data manager. So the next feature I am going to show is about the ability to go directly from one common event form to the next one when entering data for the first time to speed data entry. So we've added a new property for common event forms and specifically for repeating common event forms. I can see it on this card here. It's allow add another. And in this case, I've already checked it and I've already published the study in this configuration. So if this is not checked, then you get the old behavior, which is, you were entering a new form, you close the form, you go back to the participant details page. You can click to add a new form from there. With allow add another selected, the user is presented with another option when entering new data. And so let me demonstrate what this one does. So here's my comments event and my comments form. So as usual, I start by clicking add new to get a new form. So I have some Tylenol, I have 200 milligrams once per day. So you'll see that because I've selected that allow add another option for this form, I have, as a data entry user now, an additional option at the bottom of this form. I can check this box, and when I close or complete the form, whichever I choose to do here, instead of going back to the participant details page, it's going to jump directly to the next occurrence of this form. So check that. Let me close. Okay, so right away, I've that data has been saved. I'm now on a different form. Don't know a good dose here. So that's twice a day. So I can string these together, and I can do this as needed and for as many of these forms as I need to enter. And ConMeds is a good example of one where you may be taking history data in a form and repeating common events, and you may potentially have a number of medications to enter all at once. So I add another ConMeds form at the end here. And maybe this one I want to mark complete. So I confirm that. Again, that closes and I come up with, with this form again. I can't think of any other medication names, so I'm just going to enter test. Now I can keep doing this again as many times as I want for what I need to enter. Now, once I've hit the last form that I need to enter, I just don't check this box. Each time the form loads, this is unchecked by default. I need to proactively check it in order to cause another form to be initiated. So here I won't check it, and I'll close. Come back to the participant details page, and we can see the 4 forms I created. The first 2 I put some data in, and the latter 2 that are just have test value. So this new feature to string these forms together like that only applies when creating the forms initially for that initial data entry part of the process. So if I come back in now to edit any of these forms, I will get the edit view. I do not get that option to go directly to the next form. So it's been tailored towards that initial data entry. I can't make any changes here, but when I'm done, I'm just going to come back to this page. Same with view mode. I can open here in review only mode for an existing form, but because it's an existing form, I don't see that checkbox with the option to go directly to the next one. However, if I realize, oh, actually there's another batch of ConMeds I need to enter, I can click add new. And at this point, because I'm entering new data again, I get this checkbox down here just to show something else. I'm going to make a few selections here. So here I can choose to go directly to the next form again if I want, anytime I'm entering new data. So you can see that here. So currently that is, as I mentioned, only available for repeating common events. It is our plan in the future to enable that sort of direct form-to-form linkage for visit forms as well, for forms in visit events to go from, form 1 in the event to form 2 to form 3. Not yet available, but that is on the horizons to add some more functionality to string those together. Next thing I'll know is I'll show us just a quick point here. I'm going to reopen this form. We've made a small change to the way that selection items are tracked in the audit log. So previously, if you looked at the set of value changes for a select one or select multiple item like this, it indicated that the value would be changed from, in this case, empty to 1, from 1 to 3, from 3 to 2, etc. So it just had the internal choice name, like the database value of this. We've modified that so it still contains that, but it also contains the label that the data entry user saw when they made the selection. So here you can see that initially the data entry user changed it from empty to selecting the QD option, which is database value 1. So that's in parentheses. And then changed from that option to the TID option, which is database value 3. So in my form, I defined this as choice 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is choice 99. So we're seeing both of these, the label and the value in the history. And if you look at the audit log, you see the same thing here, the old and the new values. Instead of, as before, it would have just shown from empty to 1, from 1 to 3, etc. We still see both the label and the name, so that it's a lot clearer what was actually changed, what was changed from, and what it was changed to. Okay, and then new topic here. So we have done a very significant amount of work on the form engine for new features that it can support. And in particular, we've added functionality for general feature set that we refer to as dynamic defaults. And so I'm going to just open one of these forms to get us started. It'll take some explaining to go over it. So we previously supported calculations to calculate values on a form, and that's still supported, but we now have a few different options for how values can be derived from within the form and assigned as item values. So I will go over this very quickly here. So I have a standard calculation here for BMI. This is the existing calculation that we supported in the past. So this calculation here is based on the unit selection and the weight and the height. And anytime one of these changes, the calculation gets updated. So calculations, the old style standard calculations, they are sort of being evaluated continuously. Anytime the source data that they reference changes, the calculation will be updated automatically. You don't need to do anything special. That's just the way they work. When you open the form, it will also recalculate. So if you were to open the form and for whatever reason the height or the weight were different, like say the data had been imported using the functionality that Malcolm had shown, when you reopen that form, if for some reason this is not already in sync with what these values are, it will just recalculate automatically. So that's the standard calculations that we've supported since the beginning of OpenClinica 4. Now, the one new option is the default option. So this sets items to a default value at form load. Here's one example. I will show the form definition for this after I go over the beginning part. In this example, I'm setting the visit date on the form here to default to the event start date. So when I open this form, it automatically pulls that in and sets it. However, and we could have done that as a standard calculation, that part. The difference here is I'm able to edit it. I can change it as needed. I don't need to make it read-only. So defaults are set when the form is first loaded and never again. So even if the default refers to other items and those other items' values should change, the default will not recalculate. It's just a one-time event, which is why we can allow these to be editable after the fact, because we know that the form is never going to compete with the data that I've entered personally to try to modify that value. So we're starting with the value, it's getting submitted to our database on the load of the form, but I can change it as needed, and I can reopen this form, and it's not going to cause this value to change. We can set defaults that are just, plain like static values, like this text string here. This one here, I see my cohort C is defaulting to the value that was derived from some calculate items up here at the top. So it was defaulting there. The other case where defaults come into play is within repeating groups. So whenever you add a new repeats to a repeating group, so you've opened your form, you have one, but you add a second one, you add a third one, you add a fourth one. Each time you add a new one, any defaults for those items are applied to that new repeating group. So every time you add a new one, it impacts that new repeating group, but the existing ones are not impacted at all, does not change the data. So a default is like a, different from a standard calculation in that it runs exactly once, either at form creation or creation of a new repeating group entry, and never again. And we can make these read-only if we'd like, but we don't need to. Going back to calculations for 1 second, we only support standard calculations that are read-only. And that is because the form, as I mentioned, will always try to be updating this value. Like anytime the source values change, and when the form is reopened, it will recalculate this and make sure it's in sync with the values. So if we were to allow a user to edit this value manually, it would just get overwritten at some unknown time, or at least the next time the form was reopened. But with defaults, it's not going to, the system is never going to overwrite the value that I've entered. So let's put in a different date here just to show that. I will reopen this. So you can see here, even though initially it had defaulted to the event start date, which I believe was the 21st, it has kept the value that I've put in, has not changed it. And now there is one other type of formula that we have added, and this is a triggered calculation. So this is perhaps somewhere between the default and the standard calculation. So in this case, when I clicked yes, I have two things going on here. I have the temperature was triggered based on selecting yes to set this to 98.6. And then I have a trigger that sets the units based on the temperature that is set here. And so a triggered calculation is one where there is a trigger item, and whenever that trigger item's value change, it initiates the calculation. But other than that trigger item changing value, this is never recalculated. So it won't be recalculated on form open or any other change except the trigger item changing. So here, this was set to 98.6 automatically. I can set it to 95. It's not going to change if I reopen the form now. It's going to stay at 95. And let me see here. I do have logic that says if my temperature is above 50, assume it's Fahrenheit. If it's below 50, assume it's Celsius. So I can show you an example here. If I enter 40 as a temperature, this is the trigger for this item, and it's going to set the value to Celsius. Or if I enter higher value, set to Fahrenheit, but I can still change it as needed. So we can do a lot with these. Let me take a quick look over and show what it looks like in the form definition spreadsheet. So we have the calculation column that we've always had. We have a new column for default, and we can put the same type of expressions in the default column. And let's look specifically at temperature here. We also have the trigger column. So if there's a calculation and there's no trigger, then it's a standard calculation. It's just running all the time. If there is a trigger, then it means this item, when it's changed, causes this logic to activate. So in this case, my temp yes, no question, was temperature measured, is the trigger for the temperature item. So when that value is changed, it's set this. You can put whatever logic you want in here. So I actually included logic that if I was to change the value of the temp yes, no away from yes, and then back to yes, it's not going to overwrite the value that I had already entered. So here I've entered 95. I go from no back to yes. So even though I've caused the trigger to activate, my specific logic is keeping this value constant. So there's a lot we can do with this. And that's because in this case, I've used the once function, which says, don't change the value if there's already a value in this item. For the temperature units, as I mentioned, it would either set it to Celsius or Fahrenheit based on the temperature. You can see my formula here says that if the temperature is changed to be blank, then it's not going to set units, or it's going to set units to empty. If the temperature is less than 50, it's going to set the units to 1, which is Celsius. Otherwise, it's going to set the units to 2, which is Fahrenheit. So any change to temperature is going to trigger this logic to activate. This is also inside the once function to keep it from getting changed unexpectedly. You can see these initial calculations have defaults. These in the past could have also been calculations. They still could be calculations. As a default, it only runs on the initial form load. It doesn't run every time the form is opened. So for something like this, where I'm generating, a random value and a cohort from that, it makes a little more sense as a default. Also, as a default, defaults are processed first before calculations when a form is loaded. So first, all the defaults are loaded, and then once they're done, then calculations are processed. So if you have other defaults that are referencing these items, you would want these items to be populated by defaults as well, which I do have down here. So like I have the item that populated the cohort by default. And so these are all populated by default at the beginning of the form load. Let me come back here for a second. So we can see that there's a trigger on the age item that's going to set the last 2 items on the first page here, one to the cohort and another to the age itself. So once I enter date of birth, it's going to calculate age, and that is going to set this item and this item. And when I set the date of birth, it's also going to pull in, it's also going to cause this cross-form read that's going to pull in my username. It's going to cause that to activate as well, because that is a triggered, we can have cross-form triggered calculations. We can have cross-form defaults, both of those. So back here, let's put in a date of birth. So we see previously it wasn't showing my username. Now it's showing my username because entering the date of birth caused this to be triggered calculation to execute. The age was calculated based on the date of birth and the visit date. And this age calculation caused these triggered calculations to fire down here. So this one where it set a text string based on the cohort, and this one where it set the age itself as the value. So one thing to note here is that, in this case, the trigger and the calculation are very directly related, and that's fine. In this case, the trigger is completely different than the calculation that it's triggering. So they don't need to be directly related. They can be, but they don't need to be. we looked at the triggers for those temperature items here as well. So the yes, no question triggered the temperature, and the temperature triggered the units. This is not necessarily something you would do in real life to have this sort of like chain of events. It would probably make more sense to say that this is also triggered by the temp, yes, no question, if we wanted to set these in that case. This is just for demonstration purposes. One more example I have here before I go on. Here I have my pulse item is triggered by change in the respiration rate, and the calculation is actually empty. So when I change my pulse item, when I change my respiration rate item, it is going to clear the pulse item because this calculation is null. Let me take a quick look at that. Okay, so I have my values here. And so again, so this is triggered by respiration rate. So if I just change this, it's going to clear it because there is no calculation there. There's a trigger and the calculation is null. This back in, we do have some fairly straightforward cases, and I can show very quickly here. I have a lot of, I think, very powerful things that can be shown with this, but won't be able to get them all today, but I'll speed through as many as I can. We can have items that are just directly set to another item, as we see here. So I have kind of these items paired, that this item is triggered by new select item and it's set to the value of new select item. This one is triggered by new decimal and set to new decimal times 2. And so keep in mind, these could be read-only, but these are not. But I could make them read-only if I wanted to. Because they're not read-only, I can change the value after this is triggered calculation occurs, but then the system will change it later if the trigger happens again. So it's always something to keep in mind here. So I set choice 1, it sets this to choice 1. I can freely set it to anything else. However, if the trigger is again changed, it's going to then change the data I've entered. Same with this. I can change this data and it's saved, but if the trigger value changes, it's going to change again. We can control that using the once function, which is what I used in the temperature area. If we want the trigger to happen at some point, but then not change the value once it's been set, we can do that. Another use case here. And this is going to be this one that's been asked about in the past. So here. So I have a signature widget where I can, the user can draw a signature, and this applies to the other, image and file widgets as well. And then I have a text item afterwards that is triggered based on the signature changing. When the signature changes, it's if the signature is not empty, then it's going to set this to now, which is the current timestamp. And if the signature is empty, it's going to set this to blank, to null. And this is read only, so I can't change it afterwards. Only the system can change it. So what this is doing is it's getting a timestamp on the form showing when the signature was signed. So a second, here we go. It's my timestamp. This is the standard format that the now function returns. We could manipulate this as needed if we wanted a different format. If we make any change, we can see that the timestamp updated. So any change is going to re-trigger that. Now, the important thing to note is the reason that this is different than what we could do before with the calculation is in this case, I can close and reopen this form. This timestamp will not change. The only thing that will change it is a change to the signature. If I had used a standard calculation without a trigger, every time I reopen the form, this would be recalculated. So this new functionality is the only way to get this sort of behavior. And based on the logic I wrote, if I clear my signature, it's going to clear the timestamp. So no more timestamp. And a couple more quick options here to show how we're within repeating groups. One, this position is calculated in part based on a default and a calculation, triggered calculation together. The first instance of a repeating group on a form is typically calculated at form load. So here, my dynamic default is explicitly checking for position 1 and setting it to empty. In that case, if I had in position 1, if I had it set to a value other than empty, then when I open this form, it would have populated a value into this item that I didn't want. So I initially have it default to empty, and then I have a trigger based on that yes/no question, that if I change the yes/no value and I'm in position 1 in the repeating group, which is the first row, and I've set yes/no to yes, which is 1, then set this value to standing. So in repeating groups, the difference between the first repeat and subsequent repeats, and especially if they are relevant, may require the use of both dynamic defaults and calculations. But in using them together, I can get this to be auto-populated, but I can change it as needed. It's not going to be changed because it's just a given the trigger logic I wrote. So now when I add a new one, it's the dynamic default is going to get a new position. I also have another feature, very useful one here, which is the systolic and diastolic pressure are going to default to the value in the previous repeat row. So I have my calculation here to say if the row is 1, then set the default to empty, which is what I saw. However, otherwise set the default value to the value in the previous row. So automatically carry the value forward from one row to the next. So we can see that I got the same values by default as from the prior row. Just as a test here, let's add another one. We'll see if we'll get these values again. And each time the position continued to update based on the default there. And I think the one last example I have to show revolves around dates. So I have date items where I can select my date precision, whether I want to enter a full date or a month and year or just year. And I have it so that each of them defaults to the current day's today's date. So we get today's date for each of these are different ones. And the way I did that was, this is standard way that we capture dates with different precisions. I have my selector for which precision I want to enter. And then I have 3 different date fields, one of each appearance, standard appearance, month, year appearance, and year appearance. And they are relevant based on the selection for date precision. And then out here, each of those date fields is triggered based on a change of the date precision. And my logic for each is basically the same. It's if the date precision has been changed to the value that's relevant for this item, then set this to today, otherwise leave it unchanged, which is what the dot means. I could have also had, if it's changed to, the 1, set it to today, otherwise set it to blank. I could have done that as well there are a lot of different options. With this flexibility between the triggered calculations and the defaults, it's wide open on what kind of logic you can write. And you can use any sort of conditionals, like in cases like these, in my defaults and my triggered calculations here, to get the desired behavior that you want. One limitation I will note is that your trigger has to be an item that's visible on the form. It can't be a calculate item that's not visible on the form. That's just a behind the scenes calculation. That's that item is unable to be a trigger by itself. It has to be an item with a form control. And we can also set these in form designer. If we look at temperature, so we can see I can set the calculation, I can choose the trigger item, I can set a default value as well. So those are standard fields now in Form Designer. One other limitation is that the preview in Form Designer does not fully support these features. So if I preview while I'm in the middle of entering the form, it's actually going to treat all of the defaults as static defaults. It's not going to evaluate them as expressions. And the triggered calculations, it's going to ignore the trigger and just treat them as a standard calculation. Once I add the default, draft to my study, then I can preview it in Study Designer and it will have the expected functionality. So if I preview it here, it will work as expected. And with that, I have run through a lot of cases, and I think we're ready to move on to any questions.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Yeah, we have a number, and folks, if you want to hang on, Paul has offered to stay a few minutes extra. We can address these. So let's go ahead and we'll kind of do it chronologically. So this one is for Malcolm. Is query import just in XML at the moment, or can it be done with tabular import as well?
At the moment, queries and those other kinds of things I showed in the XML template, currently those can only be imported through the XML feature. So the tabular import does not support those yet.
Thank you. Is add another only for common repeating and not for scheduled repeating for Paul? Paul, you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, that it is only for common repeating events, not scheduled visits that are repeating. We are looking to add similar functionality for visit events, but it has not been added yet.
And then similar to that, after add new is checked, and for some reason, user is not sure if another entry is needed, will they have to go back all over if the checkbox for add another form is not checked, like what we had in the previous version?
Add new is checked. So if I understand that correctly, if I enter data in the form and I don't check that add another ConMeds form for my example, it's going to take me back to the participant details page, and then I could choose add new from the participant details page and start entering again. And if I want to, at any point during that new form entry, I can check the box on the form to add another ConMeds form or whatever form I'm dealing with, and that will restart the chain from there. If that doesn't answer the question, please let me know.
And then are these new features going to be incorporated into the kitchen sink examples?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so a lot of the functionality that I was just demoing in particular, it can be complex. You can do some great things with it. It does, take some specific logic to do it. So we are going to be putting out examples of these specific cases and others that we come upon that we find to be generally useful to make them available. Some such as
Excellent.
ones you're copying from
and
one
another
repeat
kitchen
row.
sink reference.
What's that?
Sorry.
Oh.
And there's another
Yeah.
kitchen sink reference is can you share your source files for this? So very similar to that, right?
Yeah, and as far as the actual demo form I was using, I'm happy to share that. We can post that directly. We'll be looking at making some more targeted example forms to highlight the specific types of use cases that are supported.
Excellent. Okay. Want to know the difference between default and using once in calculation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you use a calculation with once and it calculates to a non-null value, that will, for the most part, be practically the same. One key difference is with the calculation using once, it has to be read-only. With the default, it's optional whether it's read-only or not, depending on whether you want the user to be able to modify that default value. That is a key difference. The other difference is a bit more technical, and that's when the order that these expressions are evaluated at form load, that defaults are processed prior to calculations. So if you had other items that had defaults that would be dependent on this value that you're speaking of, then it would also need to be treated as a default so that it's calculated first at form load rather than as a calculation using the once function.
Excellent. And we had a couple more questions about kitchen sink, but I think we've answered that. If a value is added into the repeat count column, does the logic in the default column still trigger?
Value added, sorry, I didn't see that question. A value added into the repeat count column, does the default still trigger? Yeah, I can actually say I did not test that scenario specifically myself, but the default is triggered anytime a new repeat is added. So an expectation would be if you entered a repeat count of 5 to set up that there are 5 repeat instances, that the default should trigger on each of those rows.
All right. Excellent. And then just a few more. For tabular import, do all the mapping files have to be updated to the stack 13 format, or should the old format still work? For Malcolm.
Yeah, so the old format files should still work. The previous formats of the mapping files, it should be backwards compatible with those. So you should not need to update any of the mapping files if you have an existing pipeline like that. If you create a new one, then we would recommend that you use the new template with the new properties.
Excellent. And then one last question. This is on roles. So can viewers be given permission to sign off data?
No. Signing permission is strictly for investigators and data specialist roles. We, in the future, would like to move towards a more flexible, granular model of permissions where individual permissions like that could be added or removed from some base roles. However, that's not what we have at the moment, and the viewer is strictly viewer. So no signing or other editing.
Good. Well, thank you.
Rob,
thank
can I add one thing?
I know we're well over the time, and I appreciate everybody hanging on and appreciate your questions. And we'll be sending out a recording of this after, so you feel free to share that with your colleagues. And until the next webinar, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all.